Welcome to a gripping story of corruption, betrayal, and redemption in the heart of Hillstone. Eric Miles, a police officer caught in a corrupt system, must confront the growing tension between his duty and the truth. When Sarah Reynolds, a resilient community member, stands up against his unjust actions, Eric's world begins to unravel. Meanwhile, Julia Carter, an undercover investigator, edges closer to exposing a network of misconduct within the department. As protests erupt and secrets surface, lives are changed forever. Will justice prevail, or will the system protect itself once again? Subscribe and comment below if you're ready for a story filled with suspense, moral dilemmas, and the fight for justice. You won't want to miss what happens next. Officer Eric Miles shifted in his patrol car, the soft hum of the engine vibrating through the seat. His fingers drummed a steady beat on the steering wheel as he stared at the empty street, illuminated only by the occasional flicker of a streetlight. Another quiet night in Hillstone City. Too quiet. He sighed, his breath fogging the window slightly. Eric hated this part of town. Every crack in the sidewalk, every boarded-up shop front seemed to remind him of how far things had fallen. To him, it felt like the city was slowly decaying, and nobody cared enough to stop it. He glanced out the window again, his eyes tracing the familiar route of his patrol. This neighborhood had been his beat for the past several years, and with each passing year, his frustration grew. The same faces, the same run-down buildings, and the same excuses from people who never seemed to want to help themselves. "They're all the same," he muttered under his breath, his voice tinged with contempt. Always blaming someone else, always making excuses. His grip tightened on the steering wheel as he spotted a small group of teenagers loitering on the corner. He slowed down, his eyes narrowing as he watched them. They weren't doing anything illegal, just talking and laughing, but something about their presence bothered him. They looked too relaxed, too at ease in a place that had been overrun with problems for years. He had seen this before. The way people in these neighborhoods seemed unaffected by the chaos around them, as if they had accepted it. Eric had not. He still believed in rules, in order, and in consequences for those who broke them. And in his mind, most of the people here had given up on that a long time ago. Shaking his head, he pressed the gas pedal lightly, moving past the group. He checked the time. Another 3 hours left on his shift. He couldn't wait for it to be over, though he knew tomorrow would be the same. Nothing ever changed in Hillstone. Just as he was about to turn the corner onto another deserted street, a figure caught his eye. An older woman standing outside the closed corner store, her small frame almost swallowed by the oversized coat she wore. She held a plastic grocery bag in one hand and leaned on a cane with the other. A wide-brimmed hat obscured her face, casting shadows that made it hard for Eric to get a good look at her. He frowned, pulling over to the side of the road. There was something off about her. She seemed out of place, especially at this time of night. People didn't just stand around in Hillstone after dark without a reason. His gut told him there was more to this woman than met the eye. Eric narrowed his eyes, watching her from the driver's seat. Was she waiting for someone? Or worse, was she involved in something illegal? He had seen it before. People using older relatives or even strangers to cover for their activities. And she was definitely standing where she didn't belong. "I'm not letting this slide," Eric muttered to himself as he grabbed his flashlight and opened the car door. The sound of Eric's boots hitting the pavement echoed through the quiet night. As he crossed the street, his gaze remained fixed on the woman. She hadn't moved since he first saw her, still standing in front of the store with that same grocery bag in hand. He approached slowly, trying to size her up. She was hunched over slightly, probably in her 60s or 70s, and her coat hung loosely off her frail frame. Still, Eric had learned the hard way not to trust appearances. He had seen enough situations where someone who looked harmless turned out to be involved in something serious. "Ma'am," Eric called out, his voice firm but polite. "What are you doing out here?" The woman turned her head slowly, her face still partially obscured by the shadow of her hat. She didn't seem startled by his presence, which put him on edge. Most people, especially in this part of town, tensed up when they saw a cop approaching. But not her. "I'm on my way home," she said softly, her voice calm, almost too calm for the situation. Eric frowned. It's late? You shouldn't be out here by yourself. This isn't a safe area. The woman met his gaze, her expression unreadable. I've lived here for a long time, officer. I know the neighborhood well. Her tone wasn't rude, but there was something in her voice that irked Eric. It was the way she spoke, as if she didn't need his concern, as if she had everything under control. He took a step closer, his flashlight illuminating the ground around her feet. You got ID? He asked, keeping his voice authoritative. The woman hesitated for a moment before nodding. She slowly reached into her coat and pulled out a worn wallet, handing it to him without a word. Eric took the ID and glanced at the name, Sarah Reynolds. A local address. No criminal record popped up in his mind. She didn't seem suspicious on paper, but her demeanor was what bothered him the most. Most people in this neighborhood wouldn't talk to a cop like that. So calm, so unworried. Eric handed back the ID and crossed his arms. It's late, and this isn't the kind of place you want to be hanging around. Anything else I should know about? Sarah shook her head. Just groceries, she replied, lifting the bag slightly to show him the contents. He leaned in closer, peeking into the bag with the beam from his flashlight. There was nothing in it but a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a few canned goods. Basic items, not the sort of thing that would set off any alarms. But still, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Be careful, he said finally, stepping back and letting the suspicion linger in his voice. It's dangerous out here. Sarah nodded, though she didn't seem fazed by his words. As she turned and walked away, Eric felt a sense of unease settle in his stomach. Something about her felt off, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He watched her until she disappeared around the corner, then slowly walked back to his car. The night felt colder now, and his mind buzzed with questions. Who was Sarah Reynolds? And why did he feel like she was hiding something? The next night, Eric found himself driving past the corner store again. He wasn't on the same route as the previous night, but something had drawn him back to that spot. He couldn't stop thinking about Sarah Reynolds, the way she had looked at him, the calmness in her voice, her lack of fear. As he approached the store, his eyes scanned the sidewalk, looking for any sign of her. At first, it seemed like she wasn't there, but then, just as he was about to drive past, he saw her again, standing in almost the exact same spot as the night before. Eric felt a surge of frustration. What was she doing here again? He pulled over quickly, turning off the engine and stepping out of the car. His partner for the night, Officer Greg Brooks, raised an eyebrow as he watched Eric. You really going to mess with that old lady again? Brooks asked, leaning back in his seat. She's up to something, Eric muttered, ignoring the skeptical look on his partner's face. Brooks chuckled, shaking his head. Man, she's just an old woman with groceries. You're getting worked up over nothing. But Eric didn't hear him. His focus was already on Sarah, who was standing in front of the store, looking as calm and collected as ever. There was no sign of fear or worry on her face, no indication that she was doing anything wrong. But Eric couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He crossed the street quickly, his boots clicking against the pavement as he approached her. Back again? Sarah said quietly, her voice as calm as it had been the night before. Eric narrowed his eyes. What are you doing out here? Sarah looked at him evenly. Waiting for the bus. Eric's frustration bubbled over. There's no bus at this hour. Why are you really here? For a moment, Sarah didn't answer. She just stared at him with that same calm expression, as if she were amused by his questioning. Finally, she shrugged. I don't see what the problem is, officer. I'm not breaking any laws. Her tone was polite, but there was an edge to it that set Eric on edge. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. I know there's more to this than you're letting on. I've been in this neighborhood long enough to know when someone's up to no good. Sarah's smile faded, and for the first time, her expression became serious. You think I'm up to no good because of where I live? Eric blinked, taken aback by the sudden shift in her tone. No, I didn't say that. Yes, you did, Sarah interrupted, her voice low but firm. You see me standing here, minding my own business, and you assume I'm doing something wrong because of the color of my skin and the part of town I live in." Eric opened his mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. He had been trained to spot trouble, to trust his instincts, but now he wasn't sure if his instincts had been clouded by something else, something darker. Before he could respond, Sarah turned and walked away, leaving him standing there in silence. Over the next few weeks, Eric's encounters with Sarah became more frequent and more intense. Every time he saw her, his frustration grew. She wasn't doing anything illegal, but her presence in the neighborhood, her calm defiance, gnawed at him. It wasn't just about her standing on the corner anymore. It was about the way she made him feel powerless. His partner, Brooks, had grown tired of hearing about it. "You're losing it, man," he said one night after another uneventful shift. "She's just an old woman. Let it go." But Eric couldn't let it go. Sarah's calm demeanor, her refusal to back down, had gotten under his skin in a way he couldn't explain. It felt personal now. He found himself driving past the corner store more often, lingering longer, hoping to catch her doing something suspicious. But she never did. She was always polite, always composed, and it drove him crazy. He had filed a report with the department, but it had gone nowhere. Sarah Reynolds was clean. No criminal record, no history of trouble with the law. She was just a retired woman living in a rundown neighborhood. But Eric knew there was more to her than that. He could feel it in his gut. Inside the Hillstone City Police Department, tension was building. Complaints from residents were piling up, allegations of harassment, racial profiling, and excessive force. The department was under scrutiny, but Eric didn't think much of it. This was just part of the job as far as he was concerned. Lieutenant Carl Hinton, one of the department's top-ranking officers, had been able to keep things quiet for years. He knew how to make complaints disappear, how to smooth over incidents that could cause trouble. But lately, even Hinton was feeling the pressure. And then there was Julia Carter. Julia Carter had been working undercover for months, embedded in the Hillstone PD as part of a larger investigation into police misconduct. She had seen the corruption firsthand, the way complaints were buried, the way officers like Eric were given free rein to harass residents with little consequence. But Julia wasn't just watching Eric. She was watching the entire department, carefully gathering evidence that would expose the rot at its core. She had noticed Eric's interactions with Sarah Reynolds almost immediately. There was something about the way he targeted her, something personal. Julia wasn't sure what it was yet, but she knew it was important. If she could get to the bottom of it, she might be able to use it to bring Eric down, and by extension, bring down the corrupt officers who protected him. As the weeks went by, Julia's investigation deepened. She quietly collected statements from residents, recorded interactions between officers and civilians, and built a case against the department. But she knew she had to be careful. One wrong move and everything she had worked for could be exposed. And she wasn't ready for that. Not yet. One evening, as Julia sat in her car outside the precinct, she saw Eric leaving after his shift. He looked more tense than usual, his jaw clenched as he headed toward his car. Julia had a feeling something was about to happen. She followed him at a distance, watching as he drove toward the corner store. Sure enough, Sarah Reynolds was there, standing in her usual spot. Julia parked a few blocks away and turned on her recording equipment. She had a feeling this would be important. Eric got out of his car and approached Sarah, his posture stiff, his frustration palpable even from where Julia was sitting. She couldn't hear their conversation, but she could see the tension between them. For the first time, Sarah didn't stay quiet. She said something to Eric, and whatever it was, it struck a nerve. His face flushed with anger, his hands balled into fists at his sides. Julia zoomed in with her camera, capturing the moment as Eric took a step closer to Sarah, his face inches from hers. He was saying something, but Julia couldn't make it out over the hum of the street. Sarah remained calm, her expression unchanged. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she turned and walked away, leaving Eric standing there, seething. The next time Eric saw Sarah, it was different. The calm detachment he had tried to maintain was gone, replaced by raw frustration and anger. He had been thinking about her constantly, replaying their interactions in his mind, wondering why she had gotten under his skin the way she had. When he saw her standing outside the store again, something snapped. He crossed the street quickly, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. There was no pretense of politeness this time, no careful words or measured tone. He was done pretending. "What's your problem?" Eric spat, his voice low and dangerous. Sarah turned slowly, her calm expression a stark contrast to the anger radiating off Eric. "I don't have a problem, officer. I'm just waiting for the bus." "There's no bus here," Eric shot back, his voice rising. "Stop lying. I know what you're up to." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "What exactly do you think I'm up to?" Eric's fists clenched at his sides, his face flushing red. "People like you," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You're the reason this city is falling apart. You come into neighborhoods like this, acting like you own the place, but you don't." For the first time, Sarah's expression shifted. She didn't look angry or upset, just disappointed. "You don't know anything about me," she said quietly. Eric took a step closer, his voice a whisper now. "I know enough. You don't belong here. You never have." Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't raise her voice. "You're scared, Officer Miles," she said softly. "Scared that people like me aren't afraid of people like you anymore." Eric felt a jolt of anger surge through him, but he couldn't find the words to respond. For a moment, they just stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills. Then, without another word, Sarah turned and walked away, leaving Eric standing alone in the dark. Julia sat in her car, reviewing the footage from the previous night. She had caught the entire exchange between Eric and Sarah on camera, and it was even more intense than she had expected. Eric's words had crossed a line, not just a professional line, but a moral one. His frustration had turned into something darker, something dangerous. She knew she had to act fast. This was the evidence she needed to push the investigation forward, to expose the corruption within Hillstone PD. But she also knew that Eric was close to breaking. If she pushed too hard, he might do something reckless. Julia sent the footage to her superiors, along with a detailed report on Eric's behavior. She was careful not to reveal too much. There were still too many unknowns. But she knew that this was the tipping point. The investigation was about to enter a new phase, and there was no turning back now. Eric's frustration wasn't limited to his encounters with Sarah. The department was under increasing scrutiny, and he could feel the pressure mounting. Officers whispered about internal investigations, about complaints being re-examined, and reports being reopened. Lieutenant Hinton called Eric into his office one afternoon, his expression unusually serious. "You need to lay low," Hinton said, his voice firm. "People are starting to ask questions, and your name keeps coming up." Eric bristled at the suggestion. "I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just doing my job." Hinton gave him a long, hard look. "I don't care if you think you're doing your job. If you keep drawing attention to yourself, you're going to end up dragging the rest of us down with you. So back off." Eric didn't respond. He left the office, his mind racing. He felt like he was losing control of his job, of the situation with Sarah, of everything. And the more he tried to regain that control, the more it slipped through his fingers. As he sat in his patrol car that night, watching the streets of Hillstone, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break. And when it did, he wasn't sure he would be able to handle it. The rumblings of discontent in Hillstone had started small. Individual complaints from residents about the police. Quiet whispers of misconduct that never seemed to go anywhere. But now, those whispers had become something more. They had grown into loud, insistent demands for change. In the weeks following Eric Miles' encounter with Sarah Reynolds, the community had become increasingly vocal about the way officers were treating them. Stories began to spread, accounts of unnecessary stops, hostile interactions, and officers using their badges as weapons rather than tools for protection. The local news picked up on the story. An exposé ran on the evening news about the growing tension between the Hillstone Police Department and the predominantly minority neighborhoods it patrolled. The reporter interviewed residents who had experienced racial profiling firsthand, and the segment quickly went viral on social media. People were angry, and they wanted answers. Protests started small, with just a few dozen people gathering in front of the precinct. But within days, the crowd grew larger. Signs reading "Stop the Harassment" and "Justice for Hillstone" filled the streets, as more and more residents joined the call for accountability. For Eric, the protests were a nightmare. Each time he arrived at the precinct, he had to push through the crowd of protesters shouting at him, their eyes filled with a mixture of anger and distrust. They didn't know him personally, but it didn't matter. He was just another officer in their eyes, a symbol of the very system they wanted to change. One evening, as Eric made his way past the crowd, a protester stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "You gonna profile us tonight, officer?" The man spat, his voice filled with anger. "Or you just here to make sure we know our place?" Eric stiffened, his hand instinctively moving to his belt where his flashlight rested. "Move out of the way," he said, keeping his voice steady. The man didn't budge. "You're all the same. You think you can push us around because you've got that badge. But we're not afraid of you." For a moment, Eric's frustration threatened to boil over. But he stopped himself, took a deep breath, and walked away, ignoring the protesters' continued taunts. It was becoming harder and harder to keep his composure, and each day felt like a battle just to maintain control. The department, too, was feeling the strain. Complaints were piling up, and internal investigations were becoming more frequent. Officers were nervous, unsure of where the next accusation might come from or who would be targeted next. The once tight-knit brotherhood of the precinct was starting to fray at the edges, and Eric could feel it. Something was coming, and Eric wasn't sure if he would survive it. Julia Carter watched the protests with a sense of quiet satisfaction. This was what she had been working for, bringing the community together, exposing the corruption that had been festering in Hillstone PD for years. But she knew that this was just the beginning. Her investigation into the department had uncovered more than she had expected. She had initially thought it would be a matter of exposing a few bad officers, like Eric Miles, and holding them accountable. But the deeper she dug, the more she realized how pervasive the problem was. The corruption wasn't just limited to a few individuals, it was woven into the fabric of the department itself. Lieutenant Hinton, in particular, had become her main focus. He had been careful over the years, always staying just out of reach, never leaving a paper trail. But Julia was patient. She had been collecting small pieces of evidence, bits of conversations, subtle indications that Hinton had not only allowed misconduct to thrive, but had actively encouraged it. Still, she needed more. Eric Miles, however, was proving to be a valuable asset, even if he didn't know it. His obsession with Sarah Reynolds had given Julia exactly what she needed: proof of the department's willingness to harass innocent civilians without cause. She had already shared some of her findings with her superiors, but she wasn't done yet. There was still more to uncover. As Julia sat in her car, reviewing the footage of the latest protest, she received a text from one of her informants in the department. New complaints about Miles. "They're keeping it quiet. Might be time to move." Julia's heart raced. It was happening faster than she had expected. The department was crumbling, and soon enough, Hinton would be left exposed. She quickly gathered her notes and prepared to take the next step in her investigation. The timing had to be perfect. Eric's nights had become sleepless. The protests outside the precinct seemed to echo in his mind, their chants of justice ringing in his ears even when he was alone. He couldn't shake the feeling that the world was turning against him. And it wasn't just the protests. Things inside the precinct were changing too. He could feel it in the way people spoke to him, the way they avoided eye contact or whispered when they thought he wasn't listening. The camaraderie he had once shared with his fellow officers felt fractured, and Eric knew why. The complaints were piling up. Every time he sat at his desk, there seemed to be another email about an internal investigation or another meeting with a superior who hinted that Eric needed to adjust his approach. But what was he supposed to do? He had been following the rules, doing his job, just like he had been trained to do. Now, suddenly, the same department that had once supported him was turning its back. His frustration with Sarah Reynolds had only grown. No matter how many times he saw her, no matter how often he confronted her, She remained unbothered, calm, almost mocking him with her composure. She had become a symbol of everything that was going wrong in his life. Someone who refused to respect his authority. Someone who made him feel powerless. And it was that feeling of powerlessness that scared Eric the most. He had built his entire identity around his role as a police officer, as someone who kept order and control. Without that, who was he? One evening, after another tense shift, Eric sat in his car, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His face looked different now, hardened, more drawn, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. He barely recognized himself. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Lieutenant Hinton. "We need to talk. Don't do anything stupid." Eric's heart sank. The message was brief, but its meaning was clear. The walls were closing in, and he didn't know how to stop it. Lieutenant Carl Hinton had built his career on being careful. Careful about who he trusted. Careful about what he said. And, most of all, careful about covering his tracks. For years, he had managed to keep the department running smoothly, ensuring that the officers under his command, including Eric Miles, had the freedom to operate with little interference. But now, things were falling apart, and Hinton knew it. The protests were bad enough, but the internal investigations were worse. Complaints that had once been easily dismissed were now being taken seriously. The higher-ups were asking questions, and Hinton had to navigate each conversation carefully, making sure to protect himself while giving the appearance of cooperation. Eric Miles, however, had become a problem. His erratic behavior, his obsession with Sarah Reynolds, and the growing number of complaints against him were drawing too much attention. Hinton had covered for him in the past, smoothed things over when necessary. But now, even Hinton couldn't protect him. As Hinton sat in his office, he reviewed the latest reports on Miles. The complaints had become too numerous to ignore, and it was only a matter of time before someone higher up decided to make an example out of him. Hinton leaned back in his chair, weighing his options. He had two choices: continue to protect Miles and risk dragging himself down with him, or cut him loose and save his own career. It wasn't an easy decision. Hinton had always prided himself on loyalty, on taking care of his officers. But loyalty could only go so far. At some point, self-preservation had to come first. With a sigh, Hinton picked up his phone and dialed a number. It was time to start putting some distance between himself and Eric Miles. Sarah Reynolds had noticed the change in her neighborhood long before the protests started. She had lived in Hillstone for most of her life, and over the years, she had seen the way things had shifted. The police had always been present, but there was a time when they had felt like a part of the community, when their presence brought a sense of security. But that had changed. Now, the police felt more like an occupying force than a protective one. Their patrols seemed to be more about control than safety. And residents, especially those of color, were often treated with suspicion rather than respect. Her encounters with Officer Eric Miles had been the most unsettling. From the first time he had approached her, Sarah had sensed something off. It wasn't just the way he looked at her. It was the way he spoke, the way he seemed to view her as an outsider in her own neighborhood. She had tried to remain calm, to defuse the situation with politeness, but it hadn't worked. And now she had had enough. Sarah had kept quiet for a long time, not wanting to stir up trouble or draw attention to herself. But things were different now. The protests had given her a sense of solidarity, a feeling that she wasn't alone in her frustration. People were speaking out, and she knew it was time for her to do the same. She reached out to a local community organizer, someone who had been at the forefront of the protests. Together, they organized a small press conference outside the corner store where Sarah had encountered Eric so many times before. As the cameras rolled, Sarah stood in front of the crowd, her voice steady as she told her story. She spoke of the repeated encounters with Eric, of the way he had singled her out for no reason other than his own prejudices. She talked about the fear and frustration that came with being treated like a suspect, simply for standing in her own neighborhood. "I've lived here for 30 years, Sarah said, her voice strong, "and I'm not going to be made to feel like a stranger in my own home. We deserve better. "We all deserve better." The crowd cheered in support, and Sarah felt a sense of empowerment that she hadn't felt in a long time. She wasn't just speaking for herself, she was speaking for the entire community, and she knew that her words would be the catalyst for change. The fallout from Sarah Reynolds' press conference was immediate. The local news channels picked up the story, and within hours it had spread across the city. Her calm, measured words stood in stark contrast to the image that the Hillstone Police Department had tried to maintain. The public's reaction was swift and fierce. More residents came forward with their own stories of harassment and mistreatment at the hands of Hillstone PD. The department's reputation, already hanging by a thread, began to crumble even further. Inside the precinct, officers were on edge. The usual banter and camaraderie had been replaced with tense, hushed conversations. Everyone was watching their backs, unsure of who would be next to face scrutiny. Internal Affairs was already conducting interviews, and it seemed like every day brought a new revelation about the department's misconduct. Eric Miles, in particular, felt the pressure closing in on him. The complaints against him had multiplied since Sarah's press conference, and the department was no longer willing to look the other way. He had been called into several meetings with his superiors, each one tenser than the last. But the worst part was the way his fellow officers treated him now. Where there had once been solidarity, now there was distance. They didn't say it outright, but Eric could feel it. Their trust in him had eroded. He had become a liability, and they were starting to pull away. Lieutenant Hinton had grown colder, too. He no longer gave Eric the reassurances he once had, no longer smoothed things over. Instead, he offered cryptic warnings about the need to stay in line and not cause any more problems. Eric knew what was happening. He was being cut loose, left to fend for himself, while the department tried to salvage what little remained of its reputation. The day started like any other. Eric arrived at the precinct, the protests outside growing louder by the day, and headed inside. But today felt different. There was a tension in the air that he couldn't shake, a sense that something was about to happen. He made his way to his desk, ignoring the whispers from the other officers as he passed. He had learned to tune them out, but today their silence felt heavier than usual. His phone buzzed with a message from Hinton. "Don't come to the briefing. Meet me in my office instead." Eric's stomach tightened. He had been avoiding Hinton for days, trying to keep his head down and stay out of trouble. But now, it seemed, there was no avoiding it. When Eric stepped into Hinton's office, the lieutenant didn't look up. He was staring at a stack of papers on his desk, his jaw clenched. "You're done," Hinton said without preamble. Eric blinked, his heart skipping a beat. "What?" Hinton finally looked up, his expression hard. "I've done everything I can for you, Miles. But this is too much. The department can't protect you anymore." Eric felt the floor drop out from under him. "But I haven't." "It doesn't matter," Hinton interrupted, his voice low and sharp. "The public wants blood, and you've become the face of everything they're angry about. They're going to throw you under the bus to save the department." Eric's mind raced. He had known things were bad, but he hadn't realized just how bad. "What do I do?" Hinton leaned back in his chair, his gaze cold. "You can cooperate with Internal Affairs. Give them what they want. Or you can walk away now and try to salvage what's left of your life." Eric stared at him, unable to speak. This was it. The end of everything he had worked for, everything he had built. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. Julia Carter sat in her office, surrounded by stacks of files and evidence she had gathered over the course of her investigation. It had been months of work, months of digging through records, interviewing witnesses, and piecing together the web of corruption within Hillstone PD. And now she was almost there. Eric Miles had become the tipping point in her case. His repeated harassment of Sarah Reynolds, his growing paranoia, and the mounting complaints against him had provided Julia with the leverage she needed to push the investigation forward. But it wasn't just about Eric anymore. Lieutenant Hinton was the real prize. Julia had known from the beginning that he was the one pulling the strings, the one who had allowed the corruption to flourish. But Hinton had been careful, covering his tracks, keeping his hands clean while others did his dirty work. Until now, Julia had received a tip from one of her sources, a fellow officer in the department who had grown disillusioned with Hinton's leadership. The tip had led her to a series of emails between Hinton and several other high-ranking officers, discussing ways to manage complaints and ensure that certain incidents never reached the public eye. It was the smoking gun she had been waiting for. Now, as Julia prepared to present her findings to her superiors, she felt a sense of both triumph and trepidation. Taking down Hinton would be a major victory, but it would also send shockwaves through the department. The fallout would be messy, and she knew that there were still many more battles to fight. But for now, Julia was ready. She had spent months gathering evidence, and she wasn't going to stop until the entire system was exposed. The following week was a blur of chaos and confusion as Hillstone PD began to unravel. Internal Affairs launched a full-scale investigation into the department, pulling records, interviewing officers, and compiling evidence of widespread misconduct. Lieutenant Hinton was placed on administrative leave pending further investigation, but it was clear to everyone that his career was over. The evidence against him was damning, and his days of wielding unchecked power were numbered. For the officers still on the force, the atmosphere was tense. Some tried to distance themselves from the corruption, hoping to avoid being implicated. Others quietly resigned, realizing that their days were numbered too. Eric Miles, meanwhile, found himself in a state of limbo. The department hadn't fired him yet, but he knew it was only a matter of time. His name had become toxic, and he had been all but ostracized by his fellow officers. Every day, he walked into the precinct feeling like a ghost. No one spoke to him. No one looked at him. It was as if he had already been erased from their ranks. The protests outside the precinct had only grown louder, and the demands for accountability were reaching a fever pitch. The public wasn't just calling for the officers involved in misconduct to be held accountable. They were calling for the entire department to be dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. And as the city watched, it became clear that Hillstone PD would never be the same. Eric sat in his apartment, staring at the stack of papers on his kitchen table. It was the offer from Internal Affairs. Cooperate with the investigation, testify against Hinton, and potentially walk away with a reduced sentence, or stay silent and face the full weight of the law. He had spent hours staring at the offer, trying to decide what to do. He thought about Sarah Reynolds, about the way she had looked at him with disappointment and pity. He thought about the protests, the chants for justice that seemed to echo in his mind every time he closed his eyes. And then he thought about Hinton, the man who had once been his mentor, who had promised to protect him, but who had ultimately left him to fend for himself. Eric knew what he had to do. With a shaky hand, he picked up a pen and signed the papers. He would testify. He would tell them everything. Eric Miles sat in the small, windowless room, his palms sweating as he glanced around at the faces in front of him. The two investigators from Internal Affairs sat across the table, their expressions unreadable. He had already been briefed about the process. They would ask the questions, and he would answer them, honestly and in full. Anything less, and the deal he had been offered would be off the table. The room felt stifling. Eric shifted in his seat, rubbing his hands together in an attempt to shake the anxiety creeping through his veins. He had thought about this moment for weeks, imagined how it would feel to finally speak the truth, to come clean about everything that had happened in the department. But now, as he faced the reality of what he was about to do, doubt gnawed at him. Was he making the right choice? He had spent years being loyal to the department, to his fellow officers, and especially to Lieutenant Hinton. Even as things had started to spiral out of control, Eric had believed that loyalty would see him through. But now, that loyalty had become a trap, a sinking ship that he had to escape from. One of the investigators cleared his throat, pulling Eric from his thoughts. "Let's begin," the man said, his tone formal, but not unkind. He slid a folder across the table and opened it, revealing a series of reports and photographs. Eric's eyes scanned the documents, complaints, emails, notes from meetings he had attended over the years. It was all there. The investigator leaned forward, his gaze steady. We want to hear your side of things, Eric. Tell us about the misconduct in Hillstone PD. Tell us about Lieutenant Hinton. Eric swallowed hard, his throat tight. He glanced down at his hands, clenched together in his lap, and took a deep breath. There was no turning back now. It started years ago, Eric began, his voice shaky. At first it was small things, complaints from residents that never went anywhere, reports that were swept under the rug. I didn't think much of it back then. I thought it was just part of the job, part of keeping the peace. He paused, his heart racing as he remembered the countless times he had justified those actions to himself. He had believed he was doing the right thing, keeping the neighborhood safe, maintaining order. But now, looking back, he could see the damage that had been done. Lieutenant Hinton. He made it easy to look the other way, Eric continued, his voice growing stronger. He told us we were doing what needed to be done, that the department had our backs. But it wasn't just about keeping the peace. It became about control, about power. The investigators remained silent, letting Eric speak. He could feel the weight of their attention, their quiet understanding of just how deep this went. Eric's voice trembled slightly as he continued. The more complaints that came in, the more Hinton covered for us. He'd make deals, smooth things over with higher-ups, make sure nothing ever stuck. And we went along with it. The room was silent, save for the soft scratching of one of the investigator's pens as he took notes. Eric's confession felt like a weight lifting from his chest, but it also left him feeling raw and exposed. "And Sarah Reynolds?" the second investigator asked, his voice calm but insistent. "What about her?" Eric's chest tightened. He hadn't wanted to admit the truth about Sarah, not to anyone, not even to himself. But the time for denial was over. "I targeted her," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I harassed her because I thought she didn't belong in the neighborhood. I thought I was protecting something, but I wasn't. I was wrong." The words hung in the air, a confession not just of his actions, but of his failure as a person, as an officer. He had become the very thing he had once sworn to fight against, a symbol of injustice, of abuse of power. The investigator nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Eric's. "Thank you for your honesty, Eric. This is just the beginning. We'll need more details, more names. But you've taken an important first step." Eric nodded, though his heart felt heavy. This wasn't over. He knew that, but for the first time in months, he felt like he had made the right choice. The news broke a few days later. Local media outlets reported that Eric Miles had agreed to cooperate with the Internal Affairs investigation into Hillstone PD, and that Lieutenant Hinton had been implicated in the growing scandal. The headlines were damning, and the public reaction was swift. Protesters gathered outside the precinct, their numbers swelling as more and more residents demanded accountability. What had started as a small grassroots movement had grown into a citywide call for justice. The signs they held were blunt: "No more corruption," "We deserve better," and "Reform the police." For the officers still working in the precinct, the atmosphere had shifted from one of quiet tension to outright panic. More and more officers were being called in for questioning, and the whispers of resignation and early retirement spread through the ranks like wildfire. Some officers had already handed in their badges, unwilling to face the scrutiny that was now coming down on the department like a hammer. Lieutenant Hinton, once a commanding presence in the department, had been placed on leave. His office, which had always been a place where deals were made and complaints disappeared, now stood empty, the blinds drawn, a symbol of the power that was slipping away. Julia Carter watched the events unfold with a sense of vindication. Her investigation had finally cracked open the facade that Hillstone PD had maintained for so long. The department was being exposed for what it truly was, a system that had allowed corruption and abuse to thrive. But there was still more work to do. She wasn't done yet. Lieutenant Carl Hinton sat alone in his darkened apartment, the blinds drawn tightly against the world outside. His phone had been ringing off the hook for days. Calls from lawyers, reporters, even a few old friends offering their sympathies. But he hadn't answered any of them. The walls felt like they were closing in on him. Hinton had spent his entire career building a reputation as someone who could navigate the murky waters of law enforcement without ever getting his hands dirty. He had kept his officers in line, covered for them when necessary, and made sure that the department ran smoothly. But now, all of that was crumbling around him. He had underestimated Eric Miles. He had thought the young officer would remain loyal, that he would protect the department and the people who had protected him. But Eric had turned on him, and that betrayal stung more than Hinton cared to admit. As he sat in the dim light of his apartment, Hinton's mind raced. He had been careful over the years, meticulous even, but no one could cover their tracks forever, and the cracks in his carefully constructed facade were now starting to show. Hinton knew what was coming. Internal Affairs would soon knock on his door, armed with subpoenas and accusations. They would dig through his records, his emails, every conversation he had ever had with the officers under his command. And they would find things he had buried, things he had thought would never come to light. He had one last move to make. Hinton picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. The voice on the other end was cold and professional. "It's time," Hinton said, his voice steady. "I need a favor." Julia Carter sat in her office, surrounded by stacks of files and case notes. The investigation into Hillstone PD had snowballed over the past few weeks, uncovering more corruption than she had initially anticipated. It wasn't just about Eric Miles or Lieutenant Hinton. It was about an entire system that had been allowed to fester for years. As she sifted through the documents, Julia's phone buzzed with a new message. It was from one of her sources inside the precinct, an officer who had grown disillusioned with Hinton's leadership and had quietly begun cooperating with her investigation. "Hinton's making moves. He's planning something. Be careful." Julia's heart skipped a beat. Hinton was desperate, and desperate men made dangerous choices. She had to act quickly before he could cover his tracks. Without wasting another second, Julia gathered her things and left the office. She had a meeting with her superiors that afternoon, where she would present the final piece of evidence she had been holding on to, an email chain between Hinton and several other high-ranking officers, discussing ways to suppress complaints and manipulate reports. If everything went according to plan, Hinton's career, and the careers of those who had helped him, would be over by the end of the week. The knock on Hinton's door came early the next morning. He had been expecting it, but that didn't make it any easier. When he opened the door, he was met by two Internal Affairs agents, their expressions grim but professional. Behind them stood a handful of uniformed officers ready to take Hinton into custody. "Lieutenant Carl Hinton," one of the agents said, holding up a warrant. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and misconduct." Hinton didn't say a word. He simply nodded, his face devoid of emotion as they cuffed his hands behind his back and led him outside. As they escorted him to the waiting police car, he caught a glimpse of the crowd that had gathered across the street. Protesters, reporters, and curious onlookers, all eager to witness the fall of one of Hillstone's most powerful men. The chants of "No more corruption" echoed in Hinton's ears as they closed the car door behind him. His reign was over. Eric Miles sat in his apartment, staring blankly at the television screen. The news was filled with images of Hinton being led away in handcuffs. The crowd outside the precinct cheering as the former lieutenant was taken into custody. It should have felt like a victory, but for Eric, it felt hollow. He had done what Internal Affairs had asked. He had told them everything about the harassment, the cover-ups, the way Hinton had manipulated the system to protect himself and his officers. But it hadn't brought the closure Eric had hoped for. His life had been upended. He had been suspended from the department, pending further investigation, and his reputation was in tatters. The officers who had once been his friends now avoided him, and the community he had sworn to protect viewed him as just another corrupt cop. Eric knew he had made mistakes. He had let his anger and fear cloud his judgment, had harassed people like Sarah Reynolds for no reason other than his own insecurities. And now he was paying the price. As he sat there, the weight of his actions pressing down on him, Eric realized that he had lost everything that had once mattered to him. His career, his friends, his sense of purpose. It was all gone, and he had no one to blame but himself. Sarah Reynolds stood in the front row of the protest outside the Hillstone Police Department, her heart pounding as she listened to the speakers on the makeshift stage. It had been weeks since her press conference, and the movement for justice in Hillstone had only grown stronger. The department was being dismantled, piece by piece. Officers were being investigated, complaints were being reopened, and the city was finally starting to reckon with the years of corruption and abuse that had plagued its police force. Sarah felt a sense of pride as she looked around at the faces in the crowd. Residents, activists, community leaders, all standing together to demand accountability. For so long, people like her had been ignored, their voices drowned out by the power of the police. But now, they were being heard. As the speaker finished, Sarah stepped up to the microphone. She had been asked to speak again, to share her story with the crowd, and she was ready. "Thank you," Sarah began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you for standing with me, and with all of us, in this fight for justice. We have been patient for too long. We have been quiet for too long. But now we are speaking out, and we will not be silenced." The crowd erupted in cheers, and Sarah felt a surge of hope. This was just the beginning. The road to justice was long, and there was still much work to be done. But for the first time in a long time, Sarah believed that real change was possible. Julia Carter sat in her car, parked a few blocks away from the precinct. She had just come from a meeting with her superiors, where they had officially closed the investigation into Hillstone PD. The arrests had been made, the evidence had been collected, and the department was being restructured from the ground up. It was a victory, to be sure. But as Julia watched the protesters march through the streets, she couldn't help but feel a sense of unfinished business. The investigation had exposed the corruption in Hillstone PD, but Julia knew that the problem wasn't confined to one department or one city. The issues of systemic racism and police misconduct were far-reaching, and there were still countless communities across the country facing the same challenges. Still, Julia allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She had spent months undercover, risking her safety and career to expose the truth. And now, that truth was out in the open for all to see. But she wasn't done yet. There were more battles to fight, more stories to uncover. With a deep breath, Julia started the car and drove away, her mind already focused on the next case. The Hillstone Police Department was unrecognizable from what it had once been. The old guard had been swept away, and new leadership had been brought in to oversee the restructuring of the department. The city had appointed a civilian oversight committee to ensure that the reforms were carried out, and for the first time in years, there was hope that the department could truly serve the people of Hillstone. The process was slow, and there were still many hurdles to overcome. Trust had been shattered, and it would take time to rebuild it. But the seeds of change had been planted, and the community was watching closely to make sure those seeds would grow. For Sarah Reynolds, the changes were bittersweet. She had fought hard to bring attention to the issues in her neighborhood, but the journey had taken a toll. She had become a symbol of the movement, but at a personal cost. Still, as she walked down the streets of her neighborhood, Sarah felt a sense of peace. The tension that had once filled the air was beginning to lift, and for the first time in years, she felt like her community was being seen and heard. Eric Miles stood at the edge of the park, watching as the children played on the swings and ran through the grass. It was a scene of normalcy, of life going on despite everything that had happened. He had spent the last few weeks trying to figure out what came next. His career with the Hillstone PD was over. That much was clear, but he wasn't sure what he would do now. The choices he had made had cost him everything, and the weight of that reality was hard to bear. But Eric knew one thing: he had to move forward. He had made mistakes, yes, but he had also done the right thing in the end. He had told the truth. And now he had to live with the consequences of his actions. As he stood there, watching the world move around him, Eric took a deep breath and made a silent promise to himself. He would find a way to make amends. He would find a way to rebuild. And this time, he would do it the right way. Thank you for following this journey. If you enjoyed the story and want to see more gripping narratives, Be sure to subscribe for future updates. There's always another story waiting to be told, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts. Your support helps us keep creating meaningful stories that matter. Stay tuned, and we'll see you in the next story.